So, when you hear the name Albert Hofmann, I bet your mind jumps straight to 1960s counterculture, right? Well, in this explainer, we are going to completely rewrite that narrative. Because to truly grasp his legacy, we've got to move way beyond those popular, kind of wild caricatures. We're going to dig into his incredibly rigorous scientific methods and his really deep philosophical inquiries. Because the true story of Albert Hofmann, it's actually the story of this astonishing dual metamorphosis of both a dreaded, deadly fungus and the brilliant chemist who managed to unlock it. To really understand Hofmann, we first have to take a step back and look at this terrifying medieval curse. It was known as St. Anthony's fire. And this wasn't just some mild sickness. It was a bizarre, sweeping epidemic that literally cost tens of thousands of people their lives. Imagine the absolute horror for a medieval peasant, right? You eat your daily bread, and suddenly you're struck by severe nervous convulsions, wild hallucinations, or even gangrene creeping into your limbs. And the culprit was hiding right there in their food. It was bread made from rye that had been contaminated by a highly toxic fungus. That fungus is called ergot, or Sacali cornutum, and there is a massive historical irony here. Over the centuries, this devastating plague underwent a complete, total metamorphosis in the laboratory. What started out as this incredibly dangerous, poisonous contaminant on edible grain slowly morphed into what researchers actually came to call a rich treasure house of valuable pharmaceuticals. And Albert Hofmann? Well, he was the master key who unlocked that entire treasure house. Hofmann and his team at Sandoz Laboratories were essentially doing, well, microscopic architectural work. Alongside other brilliant scientists, Hofmann was isolating these really complex, pharmacologically useful alkaloids. They were meticulously mapping out the complex 3D shapes, the stereoisomeric forms, of lysergic acid. By figuring out exactly how to snap its core nucleus apart and then build right back upon it, kind of like molecular Legos, they were able to synthesize entirely new, highly specific medical compounds. So long before any of his more, let's say, controversial discoveries, Hofmann was out there saving lives. He isolated compounds from this medieval poison to create incredibly important clinical medicines. We're talking about hydrogene, which was used to treat cognitive decline in the elderly, dihydrogot to stabilize blood pressure, and methergene. Now, methergene is an essential drug used in gynecology, and it's actually still used today to stop life-threatening bleeding during childbirth. It is entirely possible these exact medicines saved the lives of your own ancestors, literally turning a medieval nightmare into clinical miracles. The crucial point here is that his famous problem child, LSD, was born out of this very same rigorous, highly controlled timeline of pharmaceutical exploration. He actually first synthesized LSD-25 way back in 1938 while trying to create a circulatory stimulant. But here's the wild part. He shelved it. It wasn't until 5 whole years later, in 1943, that he just had a strange hunch to look at it again. During that resynthesis, he accidentally absorbed a tiny trace amount, which led to his legendary bicycle ride and the discovery of its immense psychoactive potency. But get this, he didn't just drop out of society after that. He continued as the head of Sandoz's Natural Medicines Research Department for decades, ultimately retiring in 1971. 4,000. To really understand Hofmann's true character, you absolutely have to look at his obsession with data. He didn't just casually experience this chemical and move on with his life. Over his career, he and his staff at Sandoz collected an astonishing 4,000 scientific articles related primarily to LSD, psilocybin, and other psychoactive chemicals. They were determined not to miss a single variable. He didn't just shove a few rough notes into a desk drawer somewhere. He had his staff physically cut thousands of articles out of original global scientific journals and meticulously taped them into 93 cloth-bound binders. This exhaustive catalog, which has actually now been entirely digitized by Aeroid, completely shifts our view of the man. This wasn't the work of a counterculture rebel. This was the work of a profoundly rigorous archivist and scientist determined to understand every single facet of the genie he had just let out of the bottle. Now, let's pivot a bit and explore his philosophical transformation, which really builds a much more complete picture of who he was. Hofmann struck up a deeply intellectual, 50-year correspondence with the renowned German author Ernst Jünger. Their exchange is massive, containing nearly 400 letters and over 150 postcards. And through Jünger, what you see is a natural scientist and a literary philosopher joining forces to explore the absolute depths and mysteries of the human mind. In these letters, they constantly use this specific German word, Annäherungen, which basically translates to approaches. Think about our modern world for a second. where rapid technical progress can sometimes leave us feeling, well, a bit spiritually numb or disconnected. For Hofmann and Younger, taking psychoactive substances wasn't about chaotic excess or reckless rebellion at all. It was about shared, lifelong attempts to carefully approach and understand transcendence. They were deliberately searching for a cosmic balance and a renewed connection to nature. Together, they conducted private, highly controlled experiments starting in the early 1950s. And just picture the scene for a second. There are no chaotic parties, no loud crowds, just Hofmann wearing a morning robe, Younger dressed in an Egyptian kaftan, classical Mozart playing softly in the background, and incense burning to set the sensory framing. They meticulously measured out precise, minute doses, and get this, a doctor was always sitting quietly right there in the corner. It was a highly clinical, almost sacramental ritual completely and utterly separated from the mundane, everyday world. But of course, even with all that incredibly rigorous planning, our source material is full of some bizarre, highly humanizing moments. Like, during one session, a tiny trace amount of a substance was accidentally given to their host's mother, who was busy cooking for them. Suddenly, she runs out of the kitchen in an absolute panic, shouting, "For God's sake, I have no fried eggs! These are daisies now! What do I do?" It's such a funny, very human reminder that despite their clinical, highly intellectual intentions, they were still dealing with incredibly potent, very unpredictable forces. All of this sets up a really wild contrast when we look at how history actually remembers this compound. On one side, you have the loud, chaotic rebellion of the 1960s mass market, the widespread recreational use, and the massive flower power movements happening in places like California. But then on the exact opposite side, you have the compound's own creator, treating it like a quiet, clinical sacrament aimed purely at deep philosophical insight and musing on the natural world. Because of this massive divide, both the chemist and the author largely distanced themselves from the massive cultural wave of the 1960s. They actually completely rejected the trivialization of the chemical. To them, the widespread societal rebellion was a misuse of a profound tool. They viewed it instead as a time capsule or a vehicle for inner exploration, a way to maintain a sacred experience far away from all the noisy distractions of modern mass society and technical progress. Returning to his scientific roots, Albert Hofmann lived an extraordinarily long life, and he remained incredibly sharp right up until the very end. The University of Zurich, and honestly the global scientific community as a whole, ultimately celebrated his century-spanning life. He was officially recognized not just as some fringe cultural figurehead, but as one of the most important chemists of our time, a man who unlocked the profound mysteries of how chemicals interact with human cognitive function. To truly grasp the sheer scale of his impact, imagine the scene in Basel back in January of 2006. Over 2,000 visitors from 37 different countries gathered together in one place. And this massive international symposium, it wasn't a music festival. It was organized simply to celebrate Albert Hofmann's 100th birthday. This gathering perfectly showcased his vast, enduring legacy. Over 80 international experts presented on his life's work. Hofmann himself authored over 100 scientific articles and multiple defining books throughout his career. He is remembered today for masterfully bridging the gap between complex organic chemistry and the deepest human philosophies. And what this really teaches us is that the line between medicine, poison, and philosophy is incredibly thin. It requires rigorous, careful science to navigate properly. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder today. Consider the journey we've just taken. How does one single chemical source, derived from a toxic fungus growing on rye, manage to span the absolute extremes of human suffering, clinical healing, and the deepest mysteries of the mind? It's an incredible testament to the power of nature and the brilliant, methodical curiosity of Albert Hofmann. Thanks so much for exploring this with me today.